Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I'm very appreciative to be here at KCIS and to speak to the economic drivers. We've had a number of questions concerning international political economy and others, so I'm very happy to show my more parochial interests in economics and why I think it's more and more important that we're integrating economics into our professional military education. And hopefully I'm going to give you some reasons and rationales for why we need to be a little bit more holistic in our educational approach when we think about how the landscape is changing. Next, please. So we've had very different types of viewpoints already from our two speakers, and what I would like to promote is that I think nation states are really engaged in a new means of economic warfare. And they're using economic tools really to project their influence, and they're using it in ways to conduct geostrategic combat. And I think really the international security landscape, I would argue, is going to be really determined by how well states are going to use those economic tools. It's been ongoing for quite some time, but we've been really focused on narrow military strategy competition, geopolitical competition, versus looking at some of the underlying events that are happening at the economic level. Next, please. There are many economic drivers of change, and given that I had about 15 minutes to speak, I thought let's just throw some three important ones, I think, that are happening in very different types of domains that we should be cognizant of. The first, and Trey, my good colleague at the U.S. War College, has talked about this, the U.S. retreat from multilateralism, so I'll spend a little bit of time, not too much on that one. We've heard from a number of speakers about the rise of China, and I want to talk about, yes, we've seen a dramatic shift in GDP going from west to east to China. And in particular, I want to focus on China's use of the Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road, also another name for that initiative, and how I really think it is restructuring the international security landscape in ways that we don't really have, both US and NATO, an effective response to yet. And then finally, I want to talk about a more narrow area, one that's I'm working on research-wise, is how our adversaries are weaponizing critical infrastructure, vulnerabilities in our critical infrastructure and transportation in our lifeline sectors to challenge US and NATO. So those are some key themes that I would like to discuss, and hopefully it gives some food for thought for later discussion. Next, please. So in talking about the US retreat from multilateralism, again, we've heard themes of isolation, we've heard themes about the U.S. retreat, if you like, from multilateralism and the present administration's focus on using the U.S. market as a coercive tool to affect bilateral relationships. That, I think, is very distinctive, and it is new, and I think it has some unintended consequences in the security realm that I would like to discuss. But we're all very cognizant. I mean, we're in the first, I think, few weeks of the current administration, there was the announcement to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. NAFTA has already been renegotiated. Forget about the last 2 weeks of linking tariffs on Mexico with immigration issues, but NAFTA, the renewed NAFTA is in Congress working its way for ratification. India often gets overlooked, and we had last week, again, the announcement by this administration that it would withdraw its GSP, Generalized System Preference for Indian imports into the US because it no longer considered India a developing country. Again, renegotiations on Korea and US at a vital time when we're looking at China and North Korea relationship, and repeated threats by the current administration to withdraw from the WTO. Just last week, again, a major state visit on the part of the administration and further encouragement on the part of the United Kingdom to pursue Brexit. So we've also had, many trade wars and punitive economic sanctions, and an area that I've just come back from, and I spent a lot of time, is in Turkey with NATO, Center of Excellence Defense Against Terrorism. And punitive sanctions against Turkey are having some interesting unintended consequences too. But when we look at some of those tariffs, and particularly the graph on the on the right, we see that those tariffs, particularly when we're talking about aluminum steel, they're targeted against our key allies, the European Union, Canada, South Korea, Mexico. So it's creating a lot of churn in the multilateral domain as to why are we imposing these kind of punitive tariffs on some key allies. So the spillover from economic is certainly impacting into the international realm. And I think some of the areas that we should think about, and perhaps the administration is not really paying as much attention, nor globally, are the effects of these types of bilateral and more coercive policies. Number one, I would argue, is the stronger Sino-Russian relationship because of our policies. The second, I think, is a valuable partner of ours is India. And if we're talking about Indo-PACOM later today, the fact that we are punishing a key person, a key ally in the balance of power in that region is very conflicting. And when we look at our allies and pursuing those types of punitive tariffs with Canada and particularly with the UK and our European allies, I know within NATO circles it was a constant discussion for me justifying why was this administration further alienating a very strong alliance relationship. Finally, on that point, I think just the simple feeling of perception of unreliability and the deliberate use of such punitive tools with alliances and with friends is certainly encouraging some of our key countries from the Balkans to Southeast Asia into China's economic orbit, and particularly driving them into the arms and relationships under the Belt and Road Initiative. Next, please. So while we're seeing fragmentation, unilateralism on the part of the United States, and an important aspect of that, I think, is leaving an incredible vacuum. Our withdrawal from multilateral institutions, our lack of leadership on the global stage is creating this vacuum, which is making the Chinese ascendance, I think, even more powerful, and particularly its use of its own economic initiative through the Belt and Road. And despite China's use of BRI, and I'll give it a brief overview for those who are not as familiar with it, there's a notion that this is win-win, this is harmonious. China is using its economic power in order to encourage economic development of its countries within Eurasia. And there's a very positive approach. You can look at some wonderful videos online to see how the Chinese state is showcasing this initiative in a very positive light. But for those of us, particularly coming from more of a naval background, we see a much more deliberate, behind-the-scenes strategic approach of using the Belt and Road Initiative, both to dismantle U.S. relationships, power relationships in Indo-PACOM, and looking at China's use of Belt and Road as a major logistic support initiative for its Army, Marine Corps, and the Navy. And I'll give a few highlights of why I see that occurring. Next, please. So the Belt and Road, launched in 2013 by Xi Jinping. Really, the Belt and Road comprises of, it's an integrated approach of two policies that had been ongoing in the beginning of the mid-2000s in China. One was the economic Silk Road, which was meant to connect Chinese cities all the way through its western provinces into Europe. The other is the maritime approaches, and this was the Maritime Silk Road. And here again was a deliberate use of looking at securing the energy, trade, food, agricultural routes for Chinese economic growth to the future. It comprises a global network of ports, railroads, roads and bridges, economic zones, oil pipelines, and of course the sea lines of communication. It's nearly now up to 80 countries that have signed formal agreements under the Belt and Road Initiative, and it comprises 63% of the world's population and a significant part of the world's GDP, particularly if we're looking where the future growth is going to occur very shortly. It's been meant from a domestic point of view for China to feed its need for natural resources, secure natural resources, and particularly in the energy realm. But it's also a mechanism by which it's exporting its industrial excess capacity in steel, aluminum, cement, the construction industry. And it's stimulating a demand for Chinese state-owned enterprises and for some of its private sector champions. So there are many domestic, as a lot of economists have looked at it, domestic drivers for the Belt and Road, but I think we should really be terribly cognizant, I think, of the underpinning geostrategic ambitions of how China is going to use this economic tool to affect the international balance of power in the international system. Next, please. So if we're looking at the maritime route, and you can, I'm sorry for the, can't see this particularly well, but hopefully you'll be able to get copies of our presentations. But the Chinese, under Belt and Road, have established control of vital strategic choke points. This has been a very, very deliberate part of the Belt and Road initiative, and arteries and ports. Let me just give you a few examples. One of the major ones that is of concern for the US Navy is the establishment by the PLA of a military base in Djibouti. Now, roughly half of the world's container cargo goes through Djibouti. It is one of the most major choke points in the world. Our US Navy, our only naval base on Africa, is just a few miles away from the Chinese base. There is concern because of our short-term lease in Djibouti that the Chinese might pressure Djibouti to relinquish that lease, and that would leave us without a base there. The Chinese have invested billions into Djibouti and have expanded what was initially just a port for civilian operations and to help with humanitarian assistance in the region, which we now see frequent visits of Chinese Navy vessels. Another area of concern is the Panama Canal, and we have a 2017 treaty and a port development that is being used both for Chinese trading vessels, but also for the Chinese Navy. Berthing agreements. I mean, the Straits of Malacca is where most of China's oil supplies transiting from the Straits of Hormuz have to go through the Straits of Malacca. And this has been a particular focus for Chinese Belt and Road initiatives with ports in Gwadar, Pakistan, and also in Sri Lanka. Both have been very, very contentious issues because they have basically indebted both of these countries. The types of investments have been through loans, Chinese loans, through their state-owned banks to these countries. And the infrastructure, the actual trade has not made these ports profitable. And so the Chinese have then been able to use their coercive tools to secure 99 leases and ownership of these ports. So again, a very deliberate, a very, I think, clever strategy of using the Belt and Road to secure access to these vital choke points. And I think this first civilian, later military approach is something that we have not been paying enough attention to. Next, please. So what do I think are some of the Belt and Road impacts to the US and to NATO? Well, the first one I would argue is that just looking from a geostrategic point of view, the BRI is challenging US and NATO force projection and sustainment capabilities, particularly if we're looking at the theater of operations in the Korean Peninsula, in Taiwan, in Europe, and even in Africa and Latin America. And I look forward to hopefully some of the panel discussions later in those regions assessing Chinese intentions. The second one, I think, is that when we, again, marry up the choke points with where the energy supply routes are, if China is able to control those choke points, our future energy supply chains for forward deployed US and NATO forces are also going to be a factor that we need to consider. And we're going to need to think of a counter strategy. We also, I think Gwadar, particularly the builds-up of several other ports in Pakistan by China, is a deliberate message to the United States in terms of our Indo-PACOM pivot. And I think it is a very clear message to India, and its renewed interest in the Indian Ocean is of a deliberate concern for a potential ally that the United States and India need at this very vital time. And then finally, I would argue that the BRI is really undermining US credibility with our key allies in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Right now, we don't have a counter strategy to the BRI. I think it was about a month ago that Mike Pompeo offered for Indo-PACOM $113 million for those countries in the region. We've withdrawn for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're offering only $113 million in the face of billions by the Chinese. It really, we have a credibility gap in the region. And again, all being driven through economics. Next, please. Now I'd like to talk about something on a very different note, and that is, I think our adversaries are looking at this very critical economic tool. It's already ongoing, as a means to both use vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, global infrastructure actually, to prepare the battle space and to threaten US and NATO military supremacy. And I would argue that, again, we know through cyber attacks, but critical infrastructure, thanks to the integration of cyber into our physical critical infrastructure systems, that CIA critical infrastructure has now become the weapon of choice. And there are three areas where I see this deliberate intent on the part of our adversaries. The first, as I think has been mentioned by one of our speakers, is the ongoing hybrid warfare in Ukraine. For those that are well familiar with hybrid warfare and some of the actions by Russia, we have seen attacks on the Ukrainian electric grid multiple times. Two very serious ones that took out power in the region and in the capital for several days, right at the heart of winter. A very deliberate messaging to Ukraine by Russia of its power and use of cyber to affect that country's intentions. Not only just within Ukrainian energy sector, but transportation, government, banks, even hospitals have been attacked by Russia. That same software that was found on the electric grid, we in fact DHS dispatched some of our our readiness teams to Ukraine to help remove that malware off their systems. We have found in the US electric grid. We have absolutely been penetrated by the Russians. In 2018, DHS and the FBI had a joint statement saying so, and we've initiated actions by specific Russian operatives through our US courts. But my concern has to do with not just the fact that it's our electric grid that's being penetrated, but the fact within the Department of Defense, we rely heavily now on the private sector for our critical infrastructure needs. Before I came to the Army War College, I was assisting in all of the Pentagon reservation lifeline sectors. And we knew of quite a number of vulnerabilities within the reservation and with our DoD installations. And hence we have a great push on mission assurance to look at critical infrastructure protection. But this requires public-private partnerships, and it requires the ability for us to reach into the private sector and encourage them to develop the cybersecurity on which DoD installations will depend. And then a final factor that I will highlight in more detail, but just quickly reference it, is the Chinese have been very strategic in the use of foreign investment in our critical infrastructure. They have mapped out our defense industrial base. They have targeted purchase of our standalone suppliers for some of our components. And I know one of our speakers referenced the stability, security of our supply chains. And this is a deliberate means of Chinese, both through cyber and through purchasing. But I also want to highlight some of the strategic investment that they have used through their state-owned companies and through their private sector champions, such as Huawei. We've all heard about Huawei in the last few months, and how we're going to look at that skillful use of Huawei and our 5G networks, which is causing quite consternation among the Five Eyes. Next, please. A couple of quotes here. I don't need to read them completely, but I want to return to this issue about cyber penetration on DO installations on the US electric grid. We were very fortunate at the War College recently, a couple of years ago, for Dr. Paul Stockton to come and speak. And if we're talking about US force projection, rapid force projection to changing events in the Balkans and elsewhere, we are going to need rapid force projection capabilities. And if we're going to be penetrated even before we leave our bases and the United States or interrupt our logistics supply chains, we have a lot of work to do. And this is not an area I think that's been sufficiently addressed. And one that I'll be spending quite a bit of my time at the Army War College focused on. Next, please. Again, I referenced coming back recently, just a couple of weeks ago, from NATO. And critical infrastructure is an area that NATO is spending a lot of time with, and the complications of both NATO and host country dependence on critical infrastructure. And this is an issue that has drawn a lot of concern, but it's very, very difficult to tackle, because not only do you have issues within NATO, but you have to secure the agreements within host countries. We're all very cognizant about energy dependence of some of the key NATO allies. And President Bush, when he went, our current president, when he went over for the Brussels summit, singled out, Germany's dependence on Russian on gas. So there's been a big push within NATO to address this through a number of resiliency policies. That's a work in progress, but in the meantime, there are clear vulnerabilities. I've mentioned Huawei, Huawei or the highway. How are we going to look at a critical infrastructure like our telecommunications, whether we're talking about Europe or the US? We have very different opinions about the role of Huawei and the vulnerabilities that it would lead to having Huawei 5G on our networks. And this is something, again, that's leading to further discussions, but it's certainly an opportunity. It shows Chinese deliberate intent of using an economic tool for strategic gain with international security opportunities. The middle cartoon, if you like, that is the current Prime Minister of Italy. And they have just signed on to the BRI. They're offering up 3 ports in Italy, and this is part of a deliberate approach by the Chinese to secure the northern Adriatic ports, as well as they are now managing the port of Piraeus. So impacts for the southern flank of ours, Italy being a key NATO ally, how is that all going to play out? So we have many different ways that foreign investment by the Chinese are being used, as I mentioned, to look at how our infrastructure on which we rely and on which the military is going to be required to use in the event of war and within our current hybrid warfare environment. So with that, thank you very much. I hope I've given you some interesting things to consider. I'd like to, last pitch that, economics is a tool within security, and I look to further dialogue and discussion.